Stop me if you've ever heard this before. Guns don't kill people, people kill people. Or perhaps we just want some common sense gun laws that will keep guns out of the hands of bad people. Now, of course, we've all heard these tired slogans and empty platitudes a million times, and because there were recently some shootings in the US and also, as of yesterday, France, we are going to be hearing them spoken in the same tired manner in the same boring argument a million more times for the next several months until basically everyone forgets about it and we move on to the next politicized, sensationalized political issue. But I want to try and shed some light on this. I'm half man, half philosopher, and in the interest of keeping this video short-ish, it's already going to be too long, let's just get kind of stuck into it here. First of all, let's address the superficial slogans. First of all, of course, people on the right, people who want guns, I'm just going to call them people who want guns or want the ability to own guns, are going to say, well, the only way to stop a bad person with a gun is a good person with a gun. And of course that's false. People on the left, people who don't want guns, rightly point out that that's kind of a stupid mentality to look at this issue with. Of course, there are many ways to prevent violence. Well, prevention, of course, would be better than stopping somebody once they're already standing there with a gun trying to shoot you, or maybe moving, but anyways. I, of course, would advocate for things that many people on the right would disagree with, such as not hitting kids, perhaps reforming our justice system to a more rehabilitative form rather than the current punitive one. Perhaps I'll do a video on that in the future, but yeah, there are plenty of ways to prevent violence that have nothing to do with everyone having guns. Everyone having guns would likely be a somewhat dangerous situation, particularly if they're not trained. Right, so just a general nonviolent approach to life. Of course, improving the mental health system in America would probably be the most important. Not giving kids psychotropic drugs. That would be another good way to stop people from using guns to kill people, crazy people. Less crazy people in general would be good. And of course, there's also the Democrat or gun control advocates position that we just want common sense gun laws, and that will keep guns away from bad people. And this one, I think, is a little more disingenuous than what the people on the right are saying, in that when people on the left say they want common sense gun laws, and then they frequently point to places like Scandinavia or much of Western Europe or Japan, where basically guns are banned, or to such an extent that they are essentially banned, at least by the standards of most Americans. And when you are saying, oh, we just want a tiny little bit more legislation, we don't want to take away your guns, and then you point to places where they essentially did do that, you come off as maybe a little bit disingenuous. Like, a lot of leftists, basically, they say, we just want common gun sense, or common sense gun control laws, and then people who want guns say, no, you want to take our guns. Leftists interpret that as, oh my god, you're going to take our guns like you took our jobs with the immigrants. And there's just this perception that anybody who wants to own guns or is against gun control legislation is a religious fanatic from the South. Always from the South, I don't know why, but is just kind of an idiot for opposing what, of course, is common sense. Well, I think that is an uncharitable interpretation of what people who want guns are saying, to say the least. But perhaps there's some hidden truth on the subject, and as a matter of fact, there is. So I hope you can stomach me for another perhaps 30 minutes, I'm hoping, and we're going to go through some rather interesting data. And I will say that of all of the highly politicized and sensationalized issues that I've researched in America, the gun violence issue is probably the most blatantly obfuscated by manipulatively presented data, or let's call it lying. Whatever. Either way. But yeah, just stick with me here and we're going to figure this out. Now, the central argument that I'm going to be making revolves around this assumption. So if you want to attack this assumption, that's fine. Maybe we can get into argument that way, but my assumption is that people who want to limit the possession or ownership of guns want to do so because they believe that it will reduce the number of murders or homicides and general violent crime in America or elsewhere. I mean, otherwise, what's the point? And I'm going to be focusing on homicide here because I think that's the easiest to obtain and interpret data. If there's different information about other violent crime, please let me know. But my fundamental argument here is basically if homicides remain the same when gun control is implemented, well, you didn't really gain anything, but you did lose a freedom that you previously had. And let me take a moment to rebut your initial assumption or argument here, which is, well, guns make it a lot easier to kill, therefore they need to be specially regulated and controlled. And of course, this doesn't really make any sense morally because, for example, maybe it's really easy to poison somebody or to run them over with a car, or push them off a cliff. Somebody standing next to a cliff, man, it's super easy to just push them. Perhaps even more reliable than shooting them. But you wouldn't say that because it's easy, it therefore is worse. So it is not fundamentally the ease itself of killing which makes the killing bad, it's the killing. And your second argument will be, well, but it's easier to kill a ton of people at one time with a gun than it is by other means. Now, I'm not sure whether that's true. In fact, I would argue that it's most likely not true because people regularly drive around in 2-ton metal vehicles that are filled with like 20 gallons of flammable liquid. So you could feasibly just run into a bunch of people and then blow up your car, and that would probably kill a lot more people. Or you could, put some poison into the party's, the Kool-Aid. You could go all, I don't remember that cult leader's name. You could go all, whatever that guy's name is, on people. Not really that difficult. There are plenty of poisons you can get, which I'm sure are flavorless and odorless. You could kill a lot of people. And of course, even the Columbine shooters many years ago built pipe bombs, so it's apparently not that difficult to make explosives. There are books on it. I'm sure the internet is full of information. But let's just assume, I will assume that, yes, it is true that guns make it easier to kill many people at one time. Well, even then, it doesn't really, that's not an argument for taking away guns because, for example, it wouldn't be, if people just switched from one-time spree killings to predatory serial murder, killing 15 people over the course of several months in a creepy, Jason hockey mask kind of situation is arguably actually more terrifying than the event of somebody going and shooting a bunch of people. One of them is over a lot more quickly. At any rate, so it's not the fact that people are killed at one time that's bad. Again, it's the number of people who are killed. So what I'm going to be looking at is what correlation, if any, is there between gun control and murders. Presumably, if there is no correlation, if gun control does not correspond to, lower murder rates, then what's the point? You're dead either way. Personally, I would rather be shot than many of the other ways murderers may choose to kill me, such as stabbing, or hanging, or burning, or drowning, or, take your pick. Have you ever seen Final Destination? Or getting killed by garbage disposal, that would also be bad, whatever, Anyways, let's get to it. So the first place that I wanted to look at is the oft-cited by gun control advocate country down under, known as Australia. And, of course, the Australians had some relatively lax gun control, I believe, before 1996, when there was the Port Arthur massacre, at which time the politicians preyed on people's emotions and said, of course, they have to ban guns, which they did. Roughly, I'm sure it's still barely possible to get one in some kind of limited circumstance, but essentially you can't buy guns there. You'll have to switch to boomerang or whatever. Now, if you look at the government website, you will find this graph. Again, one would expect that after 1996, the homicide rate or violent crime will go down. And we see from 1915 to 2003, this is the percentage of murders that are committed with a gun. Not the number. So, and we'll just look at it. And yes, in fact, the percentage of homicides committed with a gun is going down after 1996. I would argue that was happening before 1996, and probably there was no relation, but it doesn't really matter. Because again, we want to know what's the number of homicides and whether the gun control has any effect on that. So, they also have this graph which shows the number of homicides per 100,000 per year from 1915 to 1998. And we can see that, of course, back in 1915 there were roughly 1.8 homicides per 100,000 per year. And thanks to the ever-increasing encroachment of gun control, they've dropped that all the way down to 1.6. So 0.2 of a person has been saved by gun control in the modern era. So the smallest midget in the world, if they reside there, may be safe. And of course, let's zoom in to the more recent time period. We have murder and manslaughter from 1993 up to 2007. And you can see murder has gone slightly down, like by 10 or 15 people. I don't really see, there's not really any relation. You could say actually right after 1996, murders actually spiked somewhat, and then they've been steadily decreasing. And you can look at the trend overall. You can see from 1990 to 2006, there's some ups, there's some downs, but it follows a pretty steady downward trend, which was probably, it's probably the same as most other countries, which have been seeing steadily decreasing violence over the past century. But I'm not going to ascribe any causation either way to the 1996 legislation. You can actually see murders spike, and then they've been going down again, so, no biggie. No particular evidence there, I would say, for gun control reducing homicide. Now let's head over to Europe, another area which is commonly cited as a great argument for why guns should be banned. And in the UK, their gun control adventure started in the 20s, apparently. Although anecdotally I heard that the only gun control in the UK for quite some time until recently was that police couldn't carry guns, which is gun control I could really get behind, as could probably every dog owner in America. So if you want to advocate for gun control and get the pet owner lobby, you should definitely try to disarm the police. It won't happen, but that's my great idea for the day. Anyways, in 1997, they passed some very strict gun control legislation, basically banning guns again. So let's see, was there any effect of these increasing gun control in the 20th century, and of course after 1997 when the strictest laws came into being? Well, I have this graph with data from the UN, and I think perhaps also a book by this Harvard psychologist called like The Better Angels. I wish I could remember his name. But of course it goes back to 1300. I find that probably a bit speculative, so although intuitively it does seem kind of right. I mean, very violent in the past, it's been getting less violent. You can see most of Europe has hovered between 20 and 60 murders per 100,000 per year in the medieval era, basically. And then that steadily fell for all countries up to the modern time. If you look at the UK, never the most violent place. They started at about 20, and then by 1725, they had reduced their murder rate to about 1 or 2 per 100,000 per year. And it's been basically down at that level ever since. But let's zoom in at the data a bit to the past 100 years or so. Here's a graph from 1990 to 2010. I think probably actually 2006. Of course, England started the 20th century at about 1 murder per 100,000 per year. And they actually have more murders now than they did before gun control even started. And of course, easily obtainable and effective firearms were available at the beginning of the 20th century. In fact, since the 1800s. So if anything, you can see as gun control has increased, so has the homicide rate. So if there's any kind of causal connection, it would be the reverse of what would be expected by gun control advocates. Although, personally, I think it probably has very little to do with gun control at all. Maybe. I don't know. You can see in the 90s, actually, murder goes up quite a bit. I don't know if that was a response. I don't know if the gun control was a response to that or what, but at any rate, no positive evidence for gun control in the UK, as the homicide rate has actually increased ever since gun control started. Other places in Europe that I looked at France. Of course, we're going to be seeing a lot of information and argument about this in the media. What I was able to find is that it actually is not that difficult to get a gun in France, despite what many on the right in America are claiming. Of course, Paris, I think what I read is that it's actually more of a cultural thing, that people don't really have, a lot of guns there. But you can't carry a gun in France. Like, if you're going to transport it, you have to disassemble and unload it. You have to have a hunting license or a sporting license to get a gun, which is probably, it varies in degree of difficulty depending on where you are. You have to go see a doctor all the time to verify that you, of course, can shoot and that you're mentally able and all that kind of stuff. I will point out that the gun control there, which is very restrictive with respect to carrying guns, has not prevented mass shootings or terrorism there. It has allowed people there to basically kill as many people as they want at will while they wait for the police to arrive, because nobody is able to carry a gun to defend themselves. And of course, bad people are still able to get guns despite the common sense gun control laws that are basically identical to what people on the left in America are advocating. So I'm not sure how effective those laws would really be in combating gun violence, as we have seen from recent events in France. But moving on, Germany also is quite strict with guns, more so than France, I think, actually. They're a little bit more difficult to analyze because of the political unrest they went through in the 20th century. Guns were alternatively available and banned depending on different political factions that got in charge, like the Nazis banning guns for certain people, and before that there was like a gun ban, and then after World War II I think they kind of relaxed their gun regulation, and then, I think it's been a steady tightening. But if we go back to the last 100 years in Europe, Germany started out 2 murders, 2 homicides per 100,000 per year, and they ended with about 1. Same with France. Kind of similar situation. So, to whatever extent gun control had an effect, it was very small, if anything. And of course, in the case of the UK, opposite, if you're going to say that there's a causal link there. Scandinavia is the non-gun owning welfare state utopia of the left. Let's see how they fare with the homicide rate and gun control. Of course, I looked at Norway. They have a gun ownership rate about 10%, and guns are strictly controlled, as in, same as Sweden. Basically, you can't own a gun for the purpose of self-defense. That is an illegitimate purpose for owning a gun. You can only have a gun for hunting or sport, and it's very difficult to get. Of course, gun control in Norway was tightened in 2009 after Anders Breivik killed a bunch of people with a gun and several bombs. I couldn't really find exactly the history, except an implication that they started about the beginning of the 20th century. If that is the case, then we can look at our data from Europe and see that Scandinavia basically was already down to about 1 homicide per 100,000 per year in 1900, and gun control has had no appreciable effect on that as far as I can see. Perhaps it has decreased gun homicides, I'm sure it probably has, but who cares, once again, if there's just the same number of homicides and people switch to stabbing, or in Australia if they switch to razor boomeranging, or, actually I heard that perhaps in Australia there was like a mass murder where they like locked the door in a big building, lit it on fire. Not the way I want to go, but it's just anecdotal. So yeah, about 10% ownership guns, and they have a homicide rate which is, I think, the same as Sweden, about 0.98 per 100,000. Not the most violent place in the world. Strict gun control, but the homicide rate has been the same since the gun control started. Sweden, it's basically almost impossible to get a gun. You can't have a gun with more than 2 bullet magazine. So again, when leftists say we just want to have common sense gun control, nobody needs a huge magazine in their gun. They can't really reasonably say that people who want guns are skeptical of their intentions with this, when we can see the end result is incremental change down to basically you can't have any bullets in your gun. So you could be forgiven for thinking that perhaps people on the left are disingenuous when they say they only want to stop at 10 or 8 or 9 or 12 or 7 or whatever number. You could reasonably be expected to think that they want what they point to in Scandinavia, which is basically a virtual ban. They have a very low murder rate in Sweden with 0.98 per 100,000, and however, the gun control hasn't stopped in the past year. Let's see, I think there have been 30 incidences of explosives being used in violent crime, and there was still a mass shooting at a bar, I think a pub, in Sweden, in spite of their common sense or not so common sense gun control. So, I mean, if that doesn't stop mass shootings, I'm not really sure what law is expected to do that, especially in a country where it is almost impossible, like Sweden. So, not great evidence there. Finland, the other Scandinavian country, has a bit of a higher murder rate at a massive 2.3 per 100,000. That's double what they have in Norway and Sweden. And wouldn't you know, they have more guns in Finland. Apparently, gun ownership there culturally is just more of a protected and cherished thing. There's a lot of history of hunting. I'm actually half Finnish. Good for you guys. But as it turns out, in spite of all that, most murders there are not committed with guns. People use knives and other implements. There were a couple of school shootings recently in Finland, but in spite of the politicians sensationalizing and trying to prey on people's emotions, they decided that they did not want to tighten their gun regulations and that was not necessary, perhaps because most murders there are not committed with a gun. So, yes, Finland has double the murder rate. It's not with guns. It appears to be probably for other reasons. But you could say this is potential evidence that gun control, or at least gun ownership might be correlated with murders. I think they have about 30% gun ownership rate in Finland. And finally, we have Switzerland, which I found quite interesting. In Switzerland, it's fairly easy to get a gun. Gun regulation is quite lax. Unless you're from places like Bosnia, Serbia, Turkey, Sri Lanka, or Algeria, where they won't allow you to buy a gun. Apparently, they think that people from those areas are dangerous and likely to use those guns in crime. So, all of you social justice warriors can storm the gates or mountains of Switzerland and come up with a good yodeling SJW slogan, like, what do we do? Algerians can't buy guns. What do we do? What do we do? Stand up, fight back. Algerians can't buy guns. What do we do? Stand up, fight back. It might work. You should go for it. I'm actually curious whether SJW's hatred of guns or their based constant white knighting for minorities, which one is more important? Like, is a black person in Switzerland's right to own a gun more important than their owning guns? I don't know. Good. If anybody knows, please let me know. But the interesting thing is that Switzerland, in spite of having quite high gun ownership, I think about 1 people out of 3 have a gun. They have the lowest homicide rate in Europe, 0.48 per 100,000. So, if in fact gun ownership is correlated with homicide, as gun control advocates, I think would have to argue, this is certainly an exception to that rule. So now I'm going to walk into an awkward cut because my hacked SLR can only record about 17 minutes of video. See you. Okay, so now I want to turn our attention to the interesting case of Russia. In Russia, there have been very strict gun regulations for at least the past 100 years, and their murder rate has hovered around 5 or 6 per 100,000 for most of the 20th century, excluding massive government genocides, of course. And then, basically, right after the fall of the Berlin Wall in the USSR, their murder rate skyrocketed up to like 20 per 100,000. There are quite a few guns in Russia unregistered. I've heard anecdotally they're not the greatest quality, but generally gun ownership and carrying guns is, or has been, highly illegal, very strict gun laws. But in spite of that, of course, there have been tons and tons of murders in Russia. A good deal more than in the United States, but we'll get to that soon enough. Recently, actually last year, almost to the day, Russia relaxed its gun laws, and basically you can own a gun for personal defense and you can carry it. That's one thing I wanted to mention from the previous part. In Switzerland, you aren't allowed to open carry or anything, so it's not exactly like United States, but neither here nor there. But in Russia now, you are allowed to open carry, you are allowed to buy a gun, you are now allowed to open carry, or at least carry on your person, pistols, long-barreled weapons, revolvers, electric shock devices, and a bevy of like homemade weapons. It's an interesting law. I don't know. I guess people are making their own homemade guns in Russia. Also, electric shock devices. You can't carry them at rallies, meetings, religious services, stuff like that. So arguably, perhaps the carry would be useless since it prohibits carrying in places where lots of people gather. But whatever. It's one step. Putin said one of the most awesome things ever, I guess. He was like, you can get a lot more done with politeness and a weapon than with politeness alone. Which, I know that's a terrible accent, but sometimes I love Vladimir Putin. He just says the most hilarious things. Interestingly, I think that most Russians were against relaxing the gun laws, but at Putin's behest, basically, they did it. So another, in non-Soviet Russia, government gives you gun rights that you don't want instead of taking ones that you do, interestingly enough. So, that was only last year, so I have no idea whether that's going to be effective. It does appear that the homicide rate was decreasing in the past several years, so it'll be difficult to tell whether relaxing the gun laws really had any effect. But just an interesting little story. And again, they have very strict gun control and very high murder rate, so it appears that the correlation is not there. Now I want to take a brief look at South America. I'm not going to go through all of the specific details of each country, but I think it's instructive to look at the information here. You can see some of the countries that have very strict gun control have very high murder rate, and some of the places with no gun control or very little gun control have a very small murder rate. If you look at, Brazil, they, of course, have very strict gun control, and they have 21 murders per 100,000, very high. But then again, you look at Honduras, they have very minimal gun control and a high murder rate of 91 per 100,000, the highest in South America. But if you look at Uruguay, they have very light gun control. I think if you're over 18, it's fairly easy to get one. And they only have 5.9 murders per 100,000. In Chile, it's somewhere in the middle, and they have only 3.1 murders per 100,000. So I'm not entirely sure what exactly is going on there, but whatever it is, seems to be more culture than gun control or laws. Perhaps. That's the argument I will probably be making, as you could probably tell by now, but let's continue on to the United States, the big kahuna, so to speak. So the history of gun control in America is early on, after the Constitution was enacted, or ratified, I should say. The state of Georgia tried to ban guns. The Supreme Court ruled that was unconstitutional. And then, of course, after the Civil War, the South tried to ban guns for black people for obvious reasons, as oppressed peoples or formerly oppressed peoples getting firearms as an equalizer is not the most beneficial thing for the former oppressors. And then I think most of that actually got struck down as well. And then the major gun control push in America came in 1968 with the Gun Control Act of that year. I'm not sure if it was a response to some particular shooting. I'm not aware of that. And then regulation steadily increased throughout the rest of the century through the ATF, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Agency. Why is it alcohol, tobacco, and firearms? Anyways. Man, they're evil, by the way. The ATF, they killed all those people at Waco. They're always involved in, the shadiest stuff. I guess, these substances are corrupting on some kind of instinctual level. And of course, various states and cities enacted gun control of various restrictiveness. Places like DC and Chicago basically banned guns. Other states had background checks. I think actually all states have background checks, or federally there's background checks. But that all changed in the 2000s when in DC v. Heller, the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional for the DC to prevent this guy from buying a gun. I think he was a veteran, or it doesn't really matter. And then, of course, McDonald v. City of Chicago, they ruled that this was a right that was incorporated against the states, and I'll get more into that later. But basically, they said you can't ban guns in the United States. So, let's see whether the gun control had any effect on homicides in the United States. Here we have 1900 up to 2000. The murder rate in 1900 was about 7 per 100,000. It steadily climbed and then went down during World War II, as in many other places, when we could send all the murderers to go murder people in other countries. Then they came back, and the murder rate goes up during the 60s to a peak in the 80s, when it then starts decreasing quite precipitously in America in the 1990s. So, if anything, you can see that the number of homicides was quite high when gun control was enacted, and basically just continued to increase. And then, it also then went down quite a bit later, and I presume has continued to do so since the Supreme Court decisions allowing people to have guns. So I don't see much of a correlation here between gun control in the late 1960s and violence, unless it's some sort of upward correlation. There's a lot of speculation as to why the murder rate has been declining in the 90s and early 2000s. Maybe people playing video games and getting their anger out that way. Maybe it was Roe v. Wade and the abortions that occurred that allowed a lot of poor people to not have children who would in the future become criminals because they weren't well taken care of. I don't know what it was. I suppose you could try to make an argument that there was some kind of delayed, there's, I guess, 20 or 30 year delayed effect of gun control, but it would be difficult to say that since so many people still have guns in America anyway. Here's the long-term, or at least estimated long-term homicide rate trend in America from 1600s, 1650, I guess. You can see it goes just like Europe. Started off quite high, around 30 per 100,000. Had its ups and downs, but followed a generally downward trend, which actually stopped in the 1950s or 60s, coinciding with gun control. So based on this graph, you could argue that gun control basically stops the decline in gun violence. However, I'm not going to ascribe that causation. I think it's just a coincidence. Maybe. I don't know. Either way. Historically, just remember advanced firearms were available since the 1800s for relatively cheap prices, and the violence did continue to decrease. However, I did consider the idea that perhaps the increased violence in the 80s, or basically throughout the 20th century, the upward trend in America could have been a result of like advanced firearms. So I looked at how people do actually kill each other in America. Now, I thought that since one of the major inventions of murder, or death in the 60s, when murder basically spiked back up, was the assault rifle, perhaps the assault rifle murder rate would be quite high or be a problem. So here is FBI Data Table 8. They are just known for their ingenuity. I'm sure it comes in a beige file at their offices. Anyways, as you can see, firearms, total firearms, 8,580 murders in 2011. Rifles responsible for all of 323 of those murders. Now, this is a very interesting fact that you should take note of, because you'll notice every time there's a shooting, there's this huge push by politicians to take away assault rifles. Why? Assault rifle, like, almost nobody ever uses assault rifles to kill people when it comes to gun violence. More people punch each other to death than kill people with rifles in America. The obvious problem, if it is a problem, is handguns, which killed 6,220 of those people in America in 2011. So maybe you might ask yourself, why is there always this push to get rid of assault rifles when assault rifles have no substantial impact on homicides? I will suggest an answer to that at the end of this video. Semi-automatic pistols were invented at the beginning of the 20th century and popularized by Browning. So there is an argument to be made that perhaps increased ownership of semi-automatic handguns increased homicides a little bit in the 20th century. But on the other hand, handguns before that were still pretty damn effective. You could get revolvers and presumably other kinds of handguns with more than 6 bullets. And even if it was 6 bullets, you can get a fast reloader and still shoot quite a few people, I would imagine. So, it's kind of a toss-up there. But either way, I don't think it was that great of an effect. Now, I would like to get to the big problem, I think, for gun control advocates and people who sensationalize violence in America in general. This is a map of the world in 2000... late 2000s. I'm not sure exactly when. You can see here, South America has a very high murder rate, as does Greenland up in the north there. Russia has a very high murder rate. Of course, Western Europe, Canada, Japan, China, and Australia have a very low murder rate, less than around 1 per 100,000. America has relatively few murders, about 5 per 100,000. It's in the second lowest category of murders per 100,000. Below Greenland, below Russia, where there's very strict gun control up until recently. Of course, below Africa. Of course, those are all estimates. But one would imagine Africa is a relatively violent place. There's countries all over the place on the map that are more violent than America. America is a relatively safe place. It is in the second safest category in the entire planet. The only places that are safer are Western Europe, Canada, and certain parts of Asia, and of course Australia. And that's for a number of reasons. Actually, I kind of wonder whether China is really that safe. But neither here nor there. America is sandwiched between one very safe place and an incredibly violent place, and maintains a very low murder rate. Now, this is the issue. Like, in order to make America seem like it has this horrifying problem with homicides, in particular gun homicides, you have to zoom so far into the data that it's ridiculous. If you look at the world in context, America is a very safe place. And especially considering that there's a gun behind every fucking tree, than, more guns than people, and there's 350 million people in America. It's amazing that there are so few gun murders and murders in general. If gun ownership and the number of guns is correlated with number of murders, then America is certainly an exception to that rule. There are very few murders in America. Russia is a very dangerous place to be. India is around America, I guess. Places in the Middle East. Eastern Europe is very dangerous. South America is very dangerous. Africa is very dangerous. Greenland apparently is very dangerous. Why is that? I mean, is Greenland just covered in guns? I doubt it. I didn't pay specific attention to Greenland, but my guess is they probably have strict gun control. Anybody wants to look that up, go ahead. But my point is, you can say, for example, Finland has double the murder rate of, Sweden, but it's only 2 per 100,000 per year. I mean, 2 is greater than 1. It's double 1, but it's only 1 more. So yeah, America does have like 5 times the murder rate of some places in Europe, but it's only 4 more per 100,000 per year. I mean, 4 per 100,000 isn't exactly a terrifying murder spree. So my point here is to urge that you look at things in context. America is not the dangerous place that it is made out to be, and it is not some kind of murder capital of the West, or at least of the world. I guess in the Western world, yes, there are more murders in America by a relatively small margin. And there are probably a number of reasons for that, which are, well, perhaps partially attributable to guns, but perhaps partially attributable to the justice system, or the multicultural history of America, or the other historical facts about the place, So, it's time for another awkward cut. Finally, I want to address some of the legalistic arguments brought up by gun control advocates about the utility and interpretation of the Second Amendment. So, in DC v. Heller and McDonald v. U.S., the Supreme Court ruled that the Second Amendment enumerates a right that pre-exists the Constitution to buy, keep, and carry firearms, and that the government may not infringe upon that right, and that, specifically in McDonald v. U.S., that right is a fundamental right, and therefore can be incorporated against the states via the 14th Amendment. So no state is allowed to make laws which essentially ban people from owning guns, which of course is a fundamental right guaranteed by the Constitution. I find it kind of amusing that when it comes to this issue, suddenly everyone becomes a seasoned legal scholar able to out-debate Antonin Scalia, who happens to be quite a smart person. I would recommend that you go read the decision. It's not a particularly difficult to read decision. It's not a super technical area of law. The argument is actually kind of interesting, and they have decent evidence. So I would go check that out. It's linked below. But let me just basically give the gist on some of the basic issues. Number one, the first clause refers to a militia. Does that mean that only people in a militia were meant to be allowed to have a gun? The Supreme Court addresses this quite well, as does Justicar in a number of videos about this subject, which I will also link below. And because I don't want this video to be forever, I will mostly rely on you just going and looking at Justicar's video. He's very smart, he gets the point, and he does a good job of it. But my understanding of it is basically everyone was intended to be the kind of person that could be a militia, and that militia could be anybody who's standing up against perhaps a tyrannical government, which leads me to another point. You should be a little bit skeptical of someone who claims that one of the amendments, which was basically meant to thwart any tyrant trying to install an authoritarian government, would actually be interpreted to increase the government's right to regulate something which previously was not regulated, i.e. in this case, owning firearms. The Bill of Rights generally enumerates things which make it difficult for people to become tyrants. It's difficult to be a tyrant when people can say whatever they want and you can't just say it's heresy and burn them. It's difficult when everybody has a gun and they can physically prevent you from doing things. It's difficult when you can't just have kangaroo courts and people can have lawyers and can have a jury of their peers. Lots of different things of that nature. Again, Justicar goes into it. I would go and watch his video, but it's unlikely that the Second Amendment was actually meant to grant the United States federal government the power to regulate something which was previously not thought to be regulated. And that also brings us to the objection from many leftists that it says well regulated. Duh, conservatives, it says well regulated right in the amendment. How could you possibly think that it wasn't meant to be regulated? Well, it's just because well regulated have a different meaning at that time. Words change, believe it or not. So well regulated used to mean just functioning properly or well. For example, having a well-regulated mind would mean that you're smart or that you think clearly, not that the government has imposed a sufficient number of laws and regulations on your brain and your thought. So you can throw your well-regulated objection out the window. I would go check out Justicar for more on the militia thing. I don't want to get into the terribly gory details on it. But the Supreme Court has ruled that this is how it is. And now you might make the argument that the Supreme Court just rules politically based on their, political leanings and that there's no objective legal reasoning or process behind it. And frankly, I'd be inclined to agree with you based on the experience I have with studying law for a few years. But if you're going to make that argument, then you should also bear in mind that you can't really be surprised when people make the same argument about your pet issue, like Roe v. Wade or the gay marriage thing or whatever it happens to be, Hobby Lobby, I guess, or Citizens United. You can't really be surprised when people use that objection against you that it's just politically motivated bullshit in that case. You're going to have it one way or the other, but you can't have it both ways. And I would note that Roe v. Wade is commonly considered to be a fairly poorly reasoned activist judge decision. Not that I'm even against it, but just so you know, there's a little aside for you. Now, finally, I wanted to get to a few other issues. First of all, I did not discuss suicide at all. I wouldn't be surprised if gun ownership increased people's ability to effectively commit suicide, but I don't consider it a bad thing, I consider it a bad thing for someone to commit suicide, obviously, but I don't consider it something that the government has any right to try to prevent by taking away the tools. You can commit suicide if you want. I don't think anybody should try to prevent that by law. And I also want to mention that I'm not the only one coming to this conclusion. So my conclusion, there is no correlation between gun control and a limitation of homicides. There are some places with a lot of gun control and high homicide rates, and there are a lot of places with low gun control and high homicide rates, or low homicide rates, or either way. There's any kind. So evidently it's some kind of cultural thing, probably, that drives murder. We've seen that murder has dropped drastically over the past few hundred years. Why is that? Especially in the West. I would guess that it is because capitalism has basically removed a lot of the scarcity that previously made people desperate, and therefore they don't have to commit crimes with guns or otherwise, because they have enough and they don't have to live in a horrible shithole. Violence in parenting has probably been decreasing over that amount of time. People live in healthier, more sanitary places. People have food. That's probably the primary driving factor that has decreased violence over time. And how much lower can we really expect it to go than 1 per 100,000? Or, I don't know. That's pretty damn low, so we'll see. But I also wanted to once again reiterate, America is not a super violent place. They don't have a million fucking murders all the time. It's barely higher than Europe. In the grand scheme of the world, America is a very safe place to live. And I will also point you and link you to a Harvard study which found basically this, that gun control and homicide rates are not really linked, and that it appears to be cultural factors or otherwise that determines how many violent crimes happen. Now, I want to briefly speculate on why governments are basically uniformly, with the exception of Vladimir Putin, trying to take people's guns. They want to disarm the civilian populace. And this, I think the basic reason was quite well described, kind of indirectly, by Carroll Quigley in Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time. A book which I highly recommend you get. Here's my sweet first edition copy. But let me read a short passage for you. So the 19th century was preceded, as was the age of Pericles, by a period in which weapons were expensive and required long training in their use. Such weapons we call specialist weapons. Periods of specialist weapons are generally periods of small armies of professional soldiers, usually mercenaries. Blackwater. In a period of specialist weapons, the minority who have such weapons can usually force the majority who lack them to obey. Thus, a period of specialist weapons tends to give rise to a period of minority rule and authoritarian government. But a period of amateur weapons is a period in which all men are roughly equal in military power. A majority can compel a minority to yield, and majority rule or even democratic government tends to rise. The medieval period, in which the best weapon was usually a mounted knight on horseback, which is a specialist weapon, was a period of minority rule and authoritarian government. Blah, 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 blah. But after 1800, guns became cheaper to obtain and easier to use. By 1840, a Colt revolver sold for $27 and a Springfield musket for not much more, and these were about as good weapons as anyone could get at that time. Thus, mass armies of citizens equipped with these cheap and easily used weapons began to replace armies of professional soldiers, beginning about 1800 in Europe and even earlier in America, obviously around the Revolution. At the same time, democratic government began to replace authoritarian governments, but chiefly in those areas where the cheap new weapons were available and local standards of living were high enough to allow people to obtain them. So, when you have a lot of people with fairly effective weapons, or at least roughly as effective as the government's, it's difficult to become authoritarian. Now, you're going to rebut this by saying, oh, there's no way a bunch of southern militiamen, because it's always people from the south, could repel the U.S. Army. Well, A, I question whether the U.S. Army would follow such orders, but kind of. But B, I mean, the U.S. military can't even hold Baghdad, and they have basically, like, rocks, you know, and I guess, like, run-down cars, or, like, Jeeps that they got from Toyota. I don't know if anybody saw those pictures. But anyways, can you imagine trying to hold America where everybody has a gun and sometimes, like, assault rifles? It's impossible. And not only do Americans have a lot more guns to defend their cities or towns or whatnot, but they're also strategically in a much better place to defend themselves against drones, since the drone operators largely live in America. So there's that factor. I mean, all the air bases are around here. I suppose we have aircraft carriers, but you're getting into a pretty crazy situation where America is using aircraft carriers to send bombers and fighters after Americans in the U.S. Not saying it's impossible, but it seems a little bit unlikely. Not only that, but of course you don't want to get to a point where you're defending against the entire U.S. military. The point is to stop dictators or horrible authoritarians before they're able to totally take over in that way. I mean, one could argue that things got especially hairy in, Germany leading up to National Socialism when Hitler started using violence against his political opponents. I mean, at that point, what are you going to do? Especially if you don't have any guns to defend your people or your opposition. So, Justicar also mentions some times that this actually happened. There's something called the Battle of Athens, I guess, where there's a kind of corrupt town mayor or something who kind of stole the election, and some people with guns went and were like, nah, I think we're going to count those ballots, and he lost, or something like that. So I would go check out his video on that subject, but yeah, I think an armed populace does have a significant deterrent effect for authoritarians. So of course they don't like it when civilians have guns, especially guns that are roughly equivalent to those of the current military or their bodyguards, for instance. So that about wraps up what I wanted to say about it. I think that I've fairly decisively proven that if your goal is indeed to prevent homicides, then gun control doesn't seem to have any particular effect. So there may be other ways of doing that. I'd love to talk about other ways of doing that. I suggest peaceful parenting, the mental health system, stopping the drug war, changing our justice system from a punitive to a rehabilitative one. There are a million things to do, but gun control, A, is a very high cost to your liberties, because that gives people the ability to search for your guns, not as well as, if they just happen to see them, take them away and fine you or put you in jail or whatever. But it also perhaps enables potential authoritarian people to take over your government, at which point you could be in a significant amount of hot water, even more so than that which Americans are already boiling in. But more on that in future videos, perhaps. So I hope you enjoyed. I hope it was enlightening. If you like this video, please share, like, comment, argue with me, tell me I'm a piece of shit. Fuck you, man. You just don't have feelings and empathy. Please, by the way, give me the concern trolling that so often comes with this argument about how I have no empathy, and how me saying that 5 murders per 100,000 really isn't that big of a deal is heartless and whatever. As it turns out, separating your emotions a little bit when you're arguing from what you're saying is usually a good idea. So, like, share, comment, share with your friends, talk about it. Hope you enjoyed. Peace out, yo.